Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. I'm your host, Cassie Stossel. On today's episode, we're talking about recovering from a toxic childhood and discovering a healthy sense of self with Dr. Daniel Lobel, author of Adult Children of Borderline Parents. Daniel is a clinical psychologist who practices in Katonia, New York. He's an internationally known expert on borderline personality disorder and consults with families all over the world who suffer with this disorder. He has taught at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, State University of New York, Hofstra School of Law, and lectures with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. He has written 4 books on the topic of BPD and also writes a blog for Psychology Today. He is author of When a Loved One Has Borderline Personality Disorder, When Your Mother Has Borderline Personality Disorder, and When Your Daughter Has BPD. Hi, Daniel. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm really excited to talk about this. I feel like we're finding that a lot of adult children are seeking help for relationships that they grew up with. And so I think this is such an important topic. So I thought we could start off with talking about what are some common wounds that adults may have if they grew up with a parent with borderline personality disorder.
Well, one of the key factors here is, in fact, that these wounds occur during childhood. And so, therefore, they're occurring during the developmental process. And so, the deepest wounds are the ones that affect the development of the child's personality.
One thing I liked about the book is you talk about healing being a process, not an event. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, people are accustomed to a medical model where you have some illness or some ailment. You go to the doctor, you get some pills, maybe you need surgery, maybe you just need rest, maybe you get some therapy, some physical therapy. And there are some of the psychiatric disorders that may be able to be treated this way. But most of them, and certainly the ones that we're here to talk about today, cannot be treated this way. And so there's an acute treatment phase, which is what I address in my book. But then you have to engage in a continued healing process, which is also a growth process, pretty much throughout the rest of your life.
Yeah, and I think when you grow up with parents with borderline or any sort of other issues, I think the way that you see behavior can be skewed. Can you talk about the difference between normal versus healthy when it comes to patterns of behavior?
Yeah, this is a topic that I've written about and spoken about quite a bit. We use the term normal, which is a term that actually is related to statistical analysis. Normal means what most people do, or what is true for most people. Unfortunately, people assume that that is the same as what's healthy, and unfortunately, that's not the case. And so when I use the term normal, I am actually referring to the statistical definition of normal, which is plus or minus one standard deviation from the mean. When we talk about mental health, trying to be normal, in my opinion, is not valid. We don't want to necessarily be like everyone else, especially in this area where people who are affected by this disorder were not raised like everybody else. And so the focus here has to be on defining what it is to be healthy and being able to pursue that in a strategic way.
So when you're working with someone, how do you sort of help them see the difference between that normal versus healthy?
We have to take a look at each behavior pattern. We have to take a look at and we'll talk more about this during our talk this morning. We have to take a look at patterns of the way we perceive things, the way we react to things, and even the way we conceptualize things, and then track those things into the future as to how they will affect our growth and our functioning and our well-being. And by doing that, we can see whether those behaviors, thoughts, concepts, or ways of reacting bring us to a better place, a healthier place, which means facilitating growth, further growth, or whether they lead us to a place where they either inhibit growth or have unwanted outcomes.
Yeah, and as you mentioned before, when we talked a little bit about the core wounds and how that's all developing while you're developing, what are some common internalized beliefs or myths that you see in those who grew up with a borderline parent?
These myths or beliefs are inculcated into the child because they're practiced consistently by the parent, often to the child, but also to others in the child's world. And one example, and it's a woeful example, is that it's okay to let people hurt you. If you grow up with a borderline parent and that or a parent that has significant symptoms of borderline personality disorder, it's very common that the parent will lash out at the child. And if the child complains about that, then the parent increases their aggressiveness. And so eventually the children learn to accept mistreatment. They then take this acceptance of mistreatment into other relationships in their lives. And if they don't encounter someone who mistreats them, that's great. But that rarely happens in this world. And so they end up allowing others to mistreat them throughout the course of their life until they heal this peace. Another example has to do with what we call blame shifting. That generally, one of the very common features of a borderline personality disorder and people who suffer from symptoms of that disorder is that it's very painful for them to take responsibility or and acknowledge that they have done something wrong or that they have caused an undesirable outcome. And so typically what they do is they blame others, often their children. These children then learn that it's that you should avoid at any cost taking responsibility or accepting blame or even apologizing when you're wrong. And so the myth there is that blaming others and avoiding taking responsibility whenever possible is something that you should pursue. That will lead the child to very negative outcomes in their life, and that's one of the myths that needs to be busted.
Yeah, and I have to wonder, and correct me if I'm wrong, but borderline is one that is underdiagnosed because those folks don't necessarily seek treatment. Is that correct?
Certainly, those folks don't necessarily seek treatment. That part is certainly true. In some cases, it's underdiagnosed, and for that reason it is, and for other reasons too. It's often underdiagnosed because clinicians don't like to make that diagnosis. I've written some articles on that. There's a number of reasons why clinicians don't like to make that diagnosis. I can get into that if you'd like, even when the diagnosis is evident. But on the other hand, there are clinicians, like with other disorders, that over sometimes it's overdiagnosed, and they see a couple of the symptoms of BPD, which can be present in other disorders or even in no disorder at all, and then immediately jump to, oh no, this is BPD, and it may not be. So it's not clear. It's not a clear pattern of underdiagnosis and overdiagnosis.
Yeah, I was just curious because the adult children seeking this, I'm wondering if they know their parent is diagnosed, or they see, as they're sort of working on their own self-awareness, see these symptoms and whatnot of what they grew up with. I was just wondering if there was any correlation there.
That's really a great point, actually. And it comes up very often in the clinical work I do, not just with children of people who have BPD, but also people who have spouses who have symptoms of BPD, and also people who themselves have children with symptoms of BPD. And in a lot of cases, people will contact me and go over criterion with me and say, gee, I think this person has it, but their doctor doesn't diagnose it or won't diagnose it, and they're looking for validation because they see these symptom clusters, and yet the diagnosis is absent, which is problematic in certain ways in providing targeted treatment for this disorder.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And you talk about in your book guilt being such a common feeling for those who grew up with a parent with BPD. Can you talk about why that is?
Well, this is exactly related to the last question you just asked me. And so, because of the blame shifting that occurs, children are blamed for things that they couldn't possibly be responsible for. For example, parents who have significant symptoms of BPD, will tell their children, "You ruined my life. You are preventing me from moving along in my life. You're preventing me from having good relationships. You're preventing me from doing the things I want to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And it happens on micro level too, where a parent will make an error and the child will say, "Gee, you were supposed to pick me up at school. You didn't show up." And the parent will say, "Well, you didn't remind me." So it's not the parent's fault that the parent knew they were supposed to pick the child up at school. It's the child's fault because the child didn't remind them. Or in some cases, and this comes up a lot, what will happen is the child, and there is an example in my book, the child will try to remind the parent, and then the parent, will say, "Oh, stop hassling me, stop nagging me. You're always nagging me." And then the parent shows up late, and then they say, "Well, the reason I was late was because you got me so upset because you nagged me that I couldn't concentrate, I couldn't focus." So these children, and this can happen, pretty much from the point of awareness. We're talking starting at 2 years old when the child first becomes aware, and they're in this situation where everything is their fault. So it's only natural. Now, 2-year-olds actually don't feel guilt. They haven't developed the ability to feel guilt yet because the experience of guilt requires additional brain maturation. But by the time they're 6, 7, 8, they start to feel guilty. And by the time they're teenagers, they start to feel like everything's their fault. Nothing they do is right. And they walk around with a chronic sense of guilt that then follows them into adulthood.
What are some ways that you can sort of start to untangle from that guilt because it is so core to who they are when they've grown up since, they were young with that feeling, and like you said, you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. No matter how you approach the parent, you're still going to be in the wrong. So how can they start to, one, identify that that belief is false, and two, start to, detangle from those feelings?
Well, that's a great question, and the simple answer is that they need to be able, as adults, which they can't do as children. They need to be able, with their adult mind and their adult sensibility, to step back from those childhood experiences and the ones also that continue into adulthood, and say, "Wait a second, I'm not the one that decided to have me as a child. You made that decision. I'm not the one that decided to send me to that school. You made that decision. I'm not the parent. You're the parent. You're supposed to pick me up. That's your job. Why am I feeling bad about this?" The more complicated answer, which is very important and that people get to, again, going back to healing as a process rather than an event, is that the child also needs to be able to differentiate actually making an error or being wrong, which children sometimes are, from the parent's need for them to be wrong, which is the blame shifting. So when you encounter a parent, or later on in life, it could be a spouse, it could be a boss who needs you to be wrong. They need the person to be wrong. And they're going to start making up stories about why you're wrong. Understanding that people sometimes need you to be wrong, or they need you to be less than, or they need you to be incompetent, or whatever it is, that doesn't mean you don't just absorb that. In recognizing that, you can then begin to deflect.
Yeah, absolutely. And at least from what I've read and sort of experienced, the person that has borderline has no self-awareness that they're putting that on you because they truly believe that they're right and that you're wrong.
And that's always a question. Generally speaking, that's probably true much of the time. But what ends up happening, a lot of these children of parents with symptoms of BPD, they will then, some of them are very intelligent people, and they can make a very, very good argument and explain to the parent things like, "I didn't choose to be born. You chose to make me born, and or to have me, to bring me into the world." And what happens is, as the adult person makes a strong logical case or a factual case, that's when the individual who has symptoms of borderline starts to deviate from reality. The term borderline refers to the fact that people who have significant symptoms of BPD not infrequently have transient psychotic states where their belief systems are delusional or quasi delusional. And that's what happens when they're confronted with undeniable facts or realities that can't be denied. Then they bring up delusional material and continue to make the case. Are they aware of that or not? Who knows?
Yeah. Super interesting, though. I want to talk a little bit about trauma. In your book, you talk about non-targeted trauma. Can you tell us what that is and give an example of what that might look like?
So, what we think about in terms of abuse trauma is targeted trauma, where a person is beaten by a parent or verbally assaulted by a parent or anybody else for that matter in everyday life as we move away from borderline psychopathology. It could be soldiers who are being shot at in combat. It could be people who attempted murders, and things like that. That's all targeted trauma, where the person is targeted for injury or in some cases death or annihilation. Non-targeted trauma is things that occur in a child's life that are traumatic, but they're traumatic in a vicarious sense. So the child witnesses things that the child is not involved in that then they experience as traumatic. For example, in one situation, this was actually a grandchild of someone went to a gym with the grandmother who had significant symptoms of BPD, and the grandmother took the child, who happened to be a male, into the woman's locker room as a form of supervision or whatever was on her mind. One of the other women in the locker room objected to a male child being in the locker room. Rather than the grandmother having a reasonable conversation with the person about it and looking perhaps for a non-gendered room, which was probably available these days, rather than that, the grandmother attacked the woman who was complaining and started screaming profanities, accusations, and threats. So the child was traumatized by observing the grandmother's behavior, even though the child was not targeted in any way by the behavior.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And what are some common trauma symptoms that you see with these adult children?
There are quite a lot of them, and let me just start with a general trauma symptom, and then go to some which are specific to this type of trauma. When we work with trauma, one of the telltale signs of trauma is dissociation. Dissociation occurs when a person is in an extremely toxic situation, experiencing high levels of fear or anxiety or a combination of those things, and cannot escape. And during those times, the person essentially escapes, they leave their awareness, they become internally focused, and they tend to, as a result of the trauma, lose their awareness. In extreme cases, this can lead to states of fugue. Fugue are states where they can lose days, hours, days, sometimes weeks, not remember what happened, even though they're not sleeping. They're walking around doing things. They don't remember what happened. Very extreme cases, the dissociation underlies multiple personality disorder in extreme situations where the person actually becomes someone else because it's too painful to be who they are and they can't escape. So all of the symptoms, or many of the symptoms that the adult child of a borderline experiences are related to this dissociation. So specific examples of symptoms that an adult might experience who've been raised that way would be extensive anxiety and discomfort around adults. It's like with any other trauma. If you were in a plane crash, you would feel anxiety and stress and fear around planes or getting on planes or anything having to do with planes. Those would be considered triggers. In this case, an adult is a trigger. And so they experience pervasive anxiety around adults. Also, having a parent treat you in this way and involving other things, lying to the child, which I think we'll get into in a little while, gaslighting the child's ability as an adult to trust others is severely damaged. They don't trust other people. And because they don't trust other people, they're deprived of the ability to have deep, intimate relationships, which cannot occur if there's not some level of trust. In addition, I'll just give you one more. There are a number of symptoms, but there's also a tremendous amount of self doubt because the child's always wrong. And the child, it's not just for negative outcomes. If the child disagrees with the parent who has significant symptoms of BPD, the child is then punished for disagreeing. The parent is always right, the child is always wrong. And so these children who can be punished by having the parent rage on them, sometimes it's physical, more often it's not physical, it's psychological, the child being told they're stupid, they don't know what they're talking about, they're crazy, whatever it might be. As adults, these children question their own perceptions, they question their own decisions, they question everything persistently, and that can lead to huge amounts of anxiety, self-doubt, which can undermine their effectiveness in business situations, in relationship situations, as parents themselves, et cetera, et cetera.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, I'm Dr. Matthew McKay, creator of Therapy Assist. We've designed Therapy Assist to be an accessible and efficient platform. By providing a library of thousands of resources and the ability to customize workbooks, we're putting evidence-based tools in your hand, helping to improve client outcomes. Research consistently shows that between-session homework can significantly improve client outcomes and reduce dropout. But finding the right tools to assign can be time-consuming. Therapy Assist makes this process faster and easier. You can search through a library of curated resources, including psychoeducation, worksheets, exercises, meditations, and much more. You can use these resources both during your sessions and as homework assignments for clients, all with the confidence that they are rooted in evidence-based therapies. Therapy Assist's resource library is built on the firm foundation of New Harbinger Publications' 50-plus years of pioneering work in self-help and psychology. So you'll have resources created by world-renowned psychologists and researchers right at your fingertips. Our platform makes it easy for you to find exactly what you need with search filters and curated protocols. These comprehensive tools provide you with the ability to search for a resource by any combination of therapy type, presenting problem, transdiagnostic mechanism, intervention, or resource type. Therapy Assist helps you support more clients between sessions in less time. I know therapists often spend hours searching through files, books, or online to find the resources they need. Therapy Assist takes care of this for you, saving you valuable time you can use to focus on what matters most, helping your clients heal and thrive. With Therapy Assist, you can also review completed resources ahead of time, which means you'll be fully prepared for each session, ready to make the most of your time with your client. We understand the importance of having access to the most effective client resources in your work, and we're committed to continuously updating our library to keep pace with the latest research and cutting-edge tools in the field. Your clients' privacy and security are top priorities for us. Therapy Assist is fully HIPAA compliant, so you can trust that the data entered is kept safe and confidential. To start your free trial and find out how Therapy Assist can transform your practice, go to therapyassist.com. We're here to support you every step of the way.
So in your book, you talk about some common damaging methods used by parents. You mention projecting, lying, gaslighting. Can you talk about more about those and their impacts, and maybe tell us an example of what that might look like so someone can recognize it?
Sure. Let's just start with the simplest of the three, which is the lying. Individuals who have significant symptoms of borderline personality disorder, when the truth bears negatively on themselves, they very often lie about it, and they'll lie about things that they did or didn't do, or lie about their effects, the way that they handled situations. They'll deny conversations that actually occurred. I didn't say that. I never said that. And you can go back. I'm working with individuals with borderline personality, because of today's technology. I'll say to someone, well, you put this in a text. I never texted that. And I can bring up the text. And they look at it and I don't remember writing that. And I'll say, but it has your signature on it, has your URL on it. And they still continue to lie about it. Well, okay, I'm an adult shrink. I can handle that. When a child experiences that, basically they're being told that their reality is not true. The next step in that, from the lying, if the child pushes back on the lying, the next step is the invocation of the gaslighting. The gaslighting is where the parent tries to convince the child that what they believe to be true, which is true, is actually not true, and that they're either crazy, stupid, or wrong to believe the truth. And so the parent will say to the child, well, if you think I said that, you must hate me. Or if you think I said that, you must be stupid or you must be crazy. Maybe we need to get you some psychiatric help because you believe things that didn't happen. When actually it did happen. The third area is the projection, which is that the parent projection. There are many, many forms of projection, and I'll just have to stick with the basic form of projection, where a parent projects either their feelings or their perceptions or even their identity onto others, and they do this with the child. So if the parent feels bad about themselves, they project that onto the child and say either that you are making me feel bad about myself, or that you feel bad about yourself, or they will then make the child feel bad about themselves because they feel bad because the parent feels bad about themselves. Now, for a child who's trying, little children are trying to understand what's real and what's not real. And they're unable to synchronize their ability to perceive their own actions, their own feelings, what's going on around them when they have a parent that's telling them that what they're seeing in front of them is not true. In my book, I refer to this as the broken mirror, where the child is a reflection to the child of reality is a distorted reality. It's not an accurate reality. It's a mirror where the child always looks bad, no matter what. And that has extreme consequences in a child who's trying to figure out who they are. It undermines their self-confidence. It undermines their self-esteem. It undermines in some cases, it undermines their ability to even tell what's real and what's not real, including their own feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. And all this damaging to the self can create, an insecure, anxious attachment style. What are the impacts for someone who grew up with that type of attachment style with their parent?
The insecure attachment style is where where the attachment is not reliable. So, because of the volatility and instability, it's the feature of borderline personality disorder is unstable mood, unstable behavior, and unstable relationships. And as a result of that, the children, when they interact with a parent who has symptomology of BPD, they never know which parent they're going to get. Are they going to get the loving, nurturing parent, which they get sometimes? Or are they going to get a hostile parent, a rejecting parent, an angry parent, a punishing parent? And in many cases, which parent they get is not determined by the child's behavior, but rather determined by the parent's mood, which has nothing to do, in many cases, with the child's behavior at all. As a result of that, this type of insecure attachment, where you never know what you're going to find, produces a tremendous amount of anxiety. So as the child begins to think about being with the parent, which they have to do all the time, they enter every single transaction with the parent, never knowing, am I going to get the nice, loving parent, or am I going to get this mean person who's going to blame me for everything? In addition to the high level of anxiety that's associated with the insecure attachment style, is the development of relationships, of a general attachment style that is transactional. Transactional means that every time you interact, the attachment is redefined. Are we close? Are we not close? Show me that we're close. Show me that we're safe. Versus a secure attachment style, where anxiety is very low, as if any, as it results. That's why it's called a secure attachment style. It's a secure attachment. Mommy's always great. She always loves me. When I'm bad, when I'm good, when I'm right, when I'm wrong, I get a loving mother. Very little anxiety there, almost no anxiety there, and a consistent way of relating within a context of intimacy. Again, these patterns then follow the children into adulthood. So a child who is raised under a fundamentally insecure attachment style will create transactional relationships with a spouse, with friends, with peers, with coworkers, whatever it is, because they don't know how to get there to the secure attachment style. On the other hand, children that are raised in a secure attachment style, they seek out these relationships that are much more reliable and much more intimate because the insecure attachment style is not safe. You don't know what you're going to get. The secure attachment style is safe because if my parent disagrees with me, if I don't get an A on a test, they still love me. They may not be happy with my behavior, but they love me and I feel it.
I want to side quest us for a second and ask if you have any advice for someone who's maybe the partner of an adult child who grew up with a borderline parent for how to support them. Like we're talking about relationships here. Do you have any advice for that partner of somebody who's working through all this healing?
Well, I wrote a whole book on that, which you can perhaps plug. What you would want the person to do in the peer relationship, in a relationship with his partner or spouse, the person would number one have to protect themselves from the projection, from the lying, from the gaslighting, and recognize that you can't fully trust a person emotionally who has this set of symptoms. And then what you seek to do is you seek to create the opposite of a transactional relationship. It's what I call a contextual relationship. And so the person who's in relationship with the spouse who has symptoms of BPD would then say, well, gee, you're very angry at me. You want a divorce today, but yesterday you were all lovey dovey. Have I changed? In other words, I haven't changed. Your perception is rocking and rolling, but you're treating me as though I've changed. I haven't changed. I treat you the same way yesterday as today, but you're acting completely differently. And so you try to create, it's very hard to do, but it can be done. It requires a lot. Again, we're back to process versus event. You have to keep on this. You just continue over and over again to create context and say, you're accusing me of lying. Am I someone who's lied to you? We've been together 10 years. When have I lied to you?
Okay, thank you. We can do a whole other episode on that. So getting back to the healing piece of your book, you talk about what you call the form before content tool. Can you talk about what that is and how that can help with setting boundaries?
The form before content rule, that's one of my favorite. I actually call it a tool rather than a rule, but it's one of my favorite tools. And I think this pertains to all relationships, not just relationships with individuals who have symptoms of BPD, but it's particularly relevant for people that do have symptoms of BPD. And what it means is that any conversation, any interaction between two people has two qualities. There's the content. That's what you talk about. Should we go for Italian food tonight? Should we go for Chinese food tonight? That's the content. The form is how it's the quality of the way that the interaction occurs. So, is it a hostile interaction? Is it a loving interaction? Is it a friendly interaction? In using the form before content tool, which I use in every single relationship, no matter what, is that if the form is not at least civil, but ideally respectful, then I don't honor the content. So you can ask me, well, hey, you schmuck, what do you want? I bet you want to go to the Chinese. You hate Italian food. You hate Italian people. I'm not going to answer that question. The form is not proper. And so I'm not saying I wouldn't respond at all. I would say I don't answer questions when I'm being spoken to that way. I don't speak to you that way. I'll be happy to talk about dinner tonight, but please speak to me with some level of civility, ideally with respect. And I will not honor the content. I will not discuss the content until the form is at least civil.
Yeah, I think that's such a good tool. just in general, like you said, with all relationships, to set that boundary of how you want to be communicated with. Earlier we talked about some of those trauma symptoms, and one of them was dissociation. Can you talk about how mindfulness can help neutralize this, as well as can you talk about intra-psychic boundaries?
Yes, the mindfulness, which is one of the tools from the DBT, from the dialectical behavior therapy, although it's not just from DBT. Mindfulness is practiced in Western philosophies. It's very prominent in Buddhism and other philosophies that encourage people to do the exact opposite of dissociation. So mindfulness is to be present. And being present not only means being physically present. For a shrink like I am, a physical presence doesn't mean much. A lot of times, people these days, and we all see it around us, people are present, but they don't hear what you're saying. They're looking at their cell phone, or they're thinking about something, or playing a song in their head, or maybe in some cases, they don't even know how to listen. And so, being present, being mindful, checking in with yourself, which is a very big part of it, and staying present as to the other things that are going around you, in particular relationships, what other people are doing, what they're saying, what's beneath what they're saying, what they're feeling, how you're affecting them, looking at a transaction. I just said something and the person looked like they were in pain. Don't ignore that. Say to the person, you were uncomfortable with what I just said. Why is that? So the mindfulness defeats the dissociation by forcing you to be fully present, ideally fully present, as much as possible. It's not an on or off switch. It's a you could be partially present, but if you're not fully present, you will miss things that are happening around you. In some cases, very, very, very important. I go, just as an example, go on an airplane. And for frequent flyers, I don't know if you are one, but if for frequent flyers, every time you get in the seat and you buckle yourself in, and then the flight attendant does this whole rigmarole about the emergency procedures. And if you look around you, people are looking at papers. Some of them are sleeping. They have headphones on. They're listening to music. Seriously? These are emergency procedures. These people are functionally dissociated, and it's dangerous. They need to be mindful. They should be listening. Yeah, I know you heard it. I know you heard it on the way out. You're hearing the same thing on the way back. This is your life. Be present. The intrapsychic boundary has to do with the issue of projection. So if a person, people can use projection. I'll give you an example in a moment. People can use projection to make you feel bad. So they can project guilt onto you. We talked about that a little bit earlier, that everything's your fault. This is your fault. You've ruined my life. And so the person who's hearing that, particularly from a parent who's supposed to always tell the truth, but who's hearing that from the parent, can be devastated, can be almost annihilated by hearing a parent tell them that they're defective, undesirable, bad, rotten, whatever terms are used, all kinds of bad terms are used there. And the intrapsychic boundary is an internal filter. And so some people have no internal filter and they absorb these projections. Well, you say I'm bad, so I guess I'm bad. There's no filter there. The intrapsychic boundary, which is internal, it's not transactional, it's not something you exercise between people. The internal boundary is a way of saying, well, this person's telling me I'm bad. Am I really bad? They need me to be bad because they're blame shifting. I'm actually not bad. And there's the boundary. I hear what you say. I'm not absorbing it, in which case I'll become sad, disabled, depressed. I'm not absorbing it. I'm going to deflect it. All right, you think I'm bad. Great. and learning not to absorb those things that are not true.
Yeah, and that goes along with the mirror metaphor that you have throughout the book. And part of a conversation that comes up when you're talking about that is the concept of emotional reprocessing. Can you talk about why that is important to the healing process?
That is the cornerstone of the healing process. For this particular population, people have been raised by a parent with symptoms of BPD. And of course, symptoms of BPD, by the way, can occur in parents that don't have BPD. They can occur in parents that have narcissistic personality disorder, other kinds of personality disorders, or other situations. But the reprocessing, in order to understand reprocessing, we just have to take a moment to talk about a Freudian concept, which is the concept of fixation. What Freud meant when he wrote about fixation, which he wrote about extensively, is that when trauma occurs in childhood, growth stops, not across the board, but growth will stop in a particular area. And when the growth stops in that particular area, the childlike behaviors and perceptions at that point of development, they don't mature while all the other abilities do mature. And so the adult ends up functioning perfectly well as an adult, but in certain situations, they become childlike. This is called regression. So we regress, another Freudian concept, we regress to the point of fixation where our growth was inhibited by traumatic overload. In emotional reprocessing, we identify those points of fixation, recognize that they were related to trauma, childhood trauma, which no longer exists. And we reprocess that information, those experiences, those events, and the information that was transmitted during those traumatic events from the adult perspective, using the rest of the sense of self, which has matured commensurate with the chronological age.
Yeah, and when you're talking about that, you talk about it's important to identify the areas where you're inhibited so that you can sort of restart that growth process. What are some ways that people can identify that?
Well, you look at behaviors, sets of behaviors in yourself, or ways of looking at things that are in fact childlike. And so, by example, this happens quite often. I'll work with some people who have been raised in this situation, and some of them are extremely successful. Some of them are very successful business people. Many of them are psychologists and psychiatrists. Many of my patients are. And so these people are capable of very, very high level, mature adult behavior. But then when they leave the office or when they leave the boardroom and then they go home and they have to deal with the spouse, they end up screaming, yelling at their spouses, over imbibing in alcohol, literally throwing things around the room, kicking things, and acting like a child, even though most of the time they act like adults. So you identify these deviations from adult behavior, and those are the markers that there is a fixation in that area and that the growth has stopped.
When we're talking about mirroring, what is direct mirroring and how can it help you create yourself?
Mirroring is a natural part of human interaction and a natural part of human behavior and a natural part of parenting. And it can be very helpful and facilitative of growth. But when you use a broken mirror, which we've already discussed, then it inhibits growth. And so there's two kinds of mirroring. It's a little bit oversimplified, but for our purposes, there's two kinds of mirroring. There's direct mirroring, which is where the parent will model behaviors for the child. This can occur in so many different situations. A parent showing a child how to tie their shoelaces, a parent teaching the child, say please, say thank you to grandpa. Okay, thank you, grandpa. And it's literally mirrored. You could take a tennis lesson and the tennis instructor, don't hold your grip this way, hold your grip this way. Don't swing a short swing, bring it all the way back. They have now these golf simulators where you can have like an icon or something on the screen that shows you exactly how to swing the racket, and then you imitate them. That's direct mirroring. The other kind of mirroring, which I call reflective mirroring, is where you come back to the child and it's not modeling, it's giving the child information about their own behavior. So if the child is engaged in play with a peer, for example, and they take the toy away from the peer, happens very often, they'll rip the toy away from a peer and the peer starts crying, the other child starts crying, and the parent says, that was a mean thing that you did to Rebecca. And so you're in that case, this is the reflective mirroring. You're mirroring the behavior back to the child and then sort of analyzing it and saying, you were mean there. Or when you do that, Rebecca's not going to want to play with you anymore. And you show the child the effects of those kind of behaviors. They're both forms of mirroring.
Yeah, and as we start to wrap up here, Daniel, I want to ask if you have any advice for someone who is sort of just starting to realize that they grew up with borderline parents, like as they're starting their journey to healing. Do you have any tips or final thoughts for anyone who's in that position?
There were some insights that that person who's entering into this process will have to accept that are very, very, very disturbing. And so you have to enter into this process, number one, with a very, very open mind, because what you're going to learn, and I can't tell you how painful this is to people. You're going to learn that your parent or parents, and sometimes the families collude. We didn't get into that today, but a lot of times, the grandparents, aunts, uncles, this stuff's happening in front of them, and they're afraid of the parent who has symptoms of BPD, so they don't intervene. And so all these people who say they love you, they're all standing there while you're being lied to, gaslighted, and abused. And for an adult who hasn't realized that before, because they've essentially been brainwashed, that realization is tremendously painful. But you have to begin with that realization, because as you go back into your emotional reprocessing, you have to realize you're reprocessing information that was incorrect. You were lied to. You were systematically lied to. You were frequently lied to. And why? So going into this process, you have to have a mind set that's open and willing to basically debunk almost everything that you remember and you believe about your childhood. So many of these people come into my office with the symptoms of the BPD being raised by a parent with BPD. And when I asked them at first, well, how was your childhood? Can you give me like just a short? I ask people that all the time. Can you just tell me a little about your childhood? Oh, nothing special. It was great. We went to the playgrounds. I went to school. And it's only, a quarter of a way into our process, several meetings that they start to realize. I'll say, well, how many times did your mother hug you all the time? Oh, yeah, all the time. Can you remember one time that your mother hugged you and it was really good? And they look at me and they can't remember even one time. And so you have you seem to have this belief that you had a loving mother. You can't tell me one time. Can you tell me one time when you needed a hug? That they can tell you. And they're going to walk out of that session realizing their whole past was basically a lie. And they have lied to themselves to protect the parent. And so going into this process, you have to be prepared to question almost every root memory and belief that you have. I'm not saying that everything's wrong, but a lot of it is. And if you're not willing to go there, and if you're not willing to be truthful and honest with yourself, you're not going to be able to move forward.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Daniel, for your time in this conversation and your work for this. This is such an important topic, and so many people are going to get help from this. So I really appreciate you and your time.
It's my great pleasure, and I'm so happy that you have me here. And to those people who are listening, I hope that this helps you in your journey, and I hope that it helps you stay with the journey and engage in that process, and sort of buckle your seatbelts for a long journey. Because I'm telling you, if you go on that journey, you'll see the light.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Heal the hidden wounds of growing up with a parent who has borderline personality disorder. Develop a healthy sense of self and reclaim your full potential. Did you grow up with a parent who has borderline personality disorder, or you suspect that they did? Was your parents' behavior unpredictable or scary? Did it seem like they were angry one minute and happy the next? Were your basic needs ignored? If so, it wasn't your fault. Children raised by a parent with BPD are subjected to a number of unhealthy and damaging behaviors, from uncontrolled anger and abuse to gaslighting, blame shifting, lying, and more. As a result of these experiences, you may have developed feelings of guilt, insecurity, and depression that have lingered throughout your adult life. This compassionate guide offers a trauma-informed approach to help you recover from your toxic childhood and discover the person you are truly meant to be. You'll learn how to identify emotional and developmental wounds and discover why interactions with your parents were so harmful to your sense of self. Then you'll learn to create a strong interpersonal boundaries and overcome feelings of guilt, anger, and low self-worth. Finally, through the act of emotional reprocessing, you'll reclaim those aspects of yourself that were lost or distorted by your trauma, so you can restart healthy growth processes and become the person you were meant to be. If you're carrying the hidden wounds of a toxic childhood, you're not alone and you can heal. With this practical and powerful guide, you can finally understand what happened, build a healthy sense of self, and reach your full potential. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code PODCAST25 to receive 25% off your entire order. New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For over 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change. The best continuing education training does more than just fulfill requirements. It opens your mind to new possibilities, increases your confidence, and gives you powerful tools to transform your clients' lives. Praxis Continuing Education and Training partners with world-class experts to create cutting-edge, evidence-based courses for mental and behavioral health professionals. Learn how to heal trauma with Robin Walzer, explore values with Kelly Wilson, and master the basics of acceptance and commitment therapy with Matt Boone through an on-demand course. Or join experts and like-minded professionals live to take your practice to a new level. Find your next training opportunity at praxiscet.com. That's praxiscet.com. Do you have an idea for another episode? Do you want to send us a message? Our email address is podcast@newharbinger.com. We'd love to hear from you. This podcast was edited by Jesse Fancushion. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope that you might share it with anyone who could benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.